Thank you so much. I'm sure we will have a lot of questions from the audience. Looking forward to hear them. In the meantime, your role also as a tutor and talking about these multiple ways of constructing realities, about the depression of fiction, about the fiction of the real. What do you think would be maybe one of the most valuable lessons that you teach to your students?
I'm not one to give lessons, I think, but no, I think one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this notion of the fictions of the real is because I sense amongst the people I work with, amongst some of the students, changing sensibilities towards what kind of films they want to make, what kind of films they can make, what kind of fictional worlds can be credible, but can also have a kind of resistance, or can transmit a sense of resistance, perhaps. So, what kind of fictional worlds can hold perhaps a possibility of resistance? That's, I think, for a lot of students, for a lot of filmmakers as well, is one of the questions, I think. And again, what I see is that more and more, again, to talk about the school, more and more students seem to go against their own teachings, especially about fiction, because where I teach, fiction is still very taught classically.
Not to mess with.
Yeah, but I guess in most schools, it's not the only school where I work sometimes, and they try to do something different. They try to really work with what is given to them in their everyday lives, or they try to work from a very simple curiosity, and things that they see, people that they meet, starting from encounters, and try to again provoke the unexpected from that, from giving time, from working with what is part of their everyday reality. So not to start from certain predetermined structures or predetermined modes of narrativity, but starting from perhaps curiosity. Curiosity is, I think, a word that needs more investigation. What does it mean, curiosity? It's not something number two. It's not only to the new, but it's a curiosity towards something that really holds your attention, and try to transmit that attention also in a cinematic world, in a film, for example. So this attentiveness, this responsiveness, is something that I hold dear. What it doesn't mean to give attention, and also to provoke attention then from the spectators. So these are some of the questions I try to talk about with them, with whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and going back to the curiosity that you mentioned, when trying to elaborate on something that is maybe personal or something that fascinates the individual, could you then try to relate that to the term you mentioned earlier, reality hunger, and how do you think that is something that we do or don't suffer from in our current society?
Do we suffer from a reality hunger? The thing what I talked about in regards to this notion of David Shields, that part of his proposition has to do with the stark opposition that he proposes between reality and between fiction as a something typically artificial. What I try to say is that again some of the fictional worlds that I hold dear are really try to cut through these oppositions. Really try to look for fiction, or try to look for the unexpected in what is supposed to be, what is in reality, into the reality that unfolds itself before us. But do we have a reality hunger? Perhaps, I don't know. I don't know how to. No, it has different names. Yeah, I just wrote a book by Brian Dillon, Essayism it's called, and I think a lot of the sensibilities that I try to talk about or try to grasp are also mentioned in that book, I think. And so perhaps this attention towards the essayistic in cinema also has to do with that. And the two films I alluded to are only possible forms of what you could call fiction of the real, but I think it has very different forms. It's looking for a new kind of fiction that starts from a very, very simple question about what kind of reality do we have in front of us, and what kind of reality do we try to create.
Yeah. Great. Are there already some questions from the audience? Not yet. I was thinking also in relation to what you mentioned, working with actors in a fiction film, or testimonials, these kind of composed testimonials. Yeah. Could you talk more about that?
Well, as it happens, 2 days ago I had a series of talks with a filmmaker called Valeska Grisebach in Brussels and in Ghent, also in the school. Valeska Grisebach is a German filmmaker, and she made a wonderful film called Western, in which she also worked with non-professional actors, with people working in construction, and people from a small village in Bulgaria. But I think what is interesting there is also that also people like Valeska Grisebach, who are positioned in the art house world, also have this investment in renewing the practice of making cinema, of making fictions. And she also starts out from very simple observations and encounters with people that she meets on the way. And I guess working with the people that she meets on the way is also a way to confront reality in a way, or to be open towards contingency, to let reality flow into the frame, literally. But at the same time, one of the difficult issues there is a lot of filmmakers who work with so-called non-professional actors, also Pedro Costa and so forth. What they accentuate when you ask about the importance of their work, they tend to accentuate the social work that they do. Pedro Costa also, he talks about the hard work that he does with the people that he works with, and the importance that he gives and that they give in playing or replaying their own lives, which was also the case in many other films. But the question is always, okay, you have this social situation, and you have this community that is created during the production of a film, but there is never, of course, a one-on-one relationship between this new community that is, or this importance that is of developing this practice of making a film, and what it ends up on the screen. That's always a difficulty with cinema. It ends up on the screen. So how does that experience of making a film resonate on the screen, and how do we as spectators resonate with what we see on the screen? So that's one of the difficulties of cinema, I think.
Yeah,
there's always a distance.
Yeah. This poetics of embodiment that you mentioned earlier also, in which persons give voice to the community and interact with the community. Do you think that in some way to new filmmakers also positions this rule of, let's say, filming what you know? So also maybe giving this restraint of, because we hear about a lot of discourse about filmmakers trying to make films in territories they're not from, and is that then also become a rule?
Well, no, it's more filming what they don't know. I think provoking the unexpected also goes for the one filming. I think one of the values in making films is also really try to use the initiative of filmmaking to provoke something that is really unexpected for all those involved. And that means also to act upon your curiosity and looking for new encounters. And I know there's also, in my school, there's also this now happening, there's also a fear of going out and confronting what is called with an awful word, perhaps otherness, alterity. So there's also, I guess, a renewed tendency to point the camera at oneself, literally. I should think looking for encounters, looking for a new way of confronting or negotiating this distance between one who is making a film and is handling a camera, and one and those who are filming, which poses a kind of inequality, let's say, or the kind of power play, to take the risk of negotiating that distance and that inequality, let's say.
Yeah, because I feel that
exchange of unequal exchange, as it's called. Van der Keuken talked about the unequal exchange, I think.
Yeah, because I feel that in fiction, perhaps this is done more often than in documentary, for example, because there is this certain element of being, not being subjective that is expected also in documentary, and that I'm very interested in relation to what you're talking about is what new forms of, documentary, but also reality or fiction and reality can that then bring about?
Oh, it's the question about subjectiveness. All the easy questions. No, but as a filmmaker, you bring your own history with you, of course, and everything that you have seen, including in cinema and what around you. You bring your own vision on your environment, a vision on your world, your vision on cinema. You bring your own history with you. So that's also an investment, and you try to work with what is given to you. So again, it's always a negotiation, I think. So how to find a balance between that? So to not only make the film about yourself, but it's also about that what you find in front of you. But you can never, of course, completely neutralize that it comes from somebody. There's always an exchange.
Yeah. But I feel that documentary often pretends to be objective, and that is maybe, while it can never be, of course.
Film is not reality. It's a condensation. It's in the best case a displacement, but it's never reality. That's the whole issue about representation. No, film is not reality. So you have to. There's always a frame. So you have to work against what is seen as objective, or you have to work against what is perhaps the consensual way of transmitting a certain objective reality. So you have to work against what is the dominant use of cinema in fiction or in documentary, whatever. What can I say?
Yeah. Yes, a question there.
I might drift a little bit from this last things that you said, but what I'm interested, you didn't mention. I mean, it's hard to talk about documentary film fiction and to do these types of films and to go into genres and whatever. It's not the topic, or it's not what we kind of want to do here now. But I do have to mention experimental film as something that was not really mentioned here, and I have a feeling that is a type of kind of filmmaking practice that has from the beginning been, or it was born from the resistance of the dominant cinema making, the dominant narrative. Mm-hmm. So in a way, if it's allowed to kind of to speak about experimental cinema as some kind of a mode of filmmaking, then maybe it would be interesting to kind of bring it into conversation and to as this resistance mode of to fictions, right? like main narratives. No?
Well, fiction cinema is not one thing. There's so many different histories that go on behind this so-called category, and so many notions, different notions and interpretations of what is supposed to be the avant-garde and so forth. I don't know, is Tropier experimental? Is Valles Carrizo experimental?
Yeah.
What can I say? You mean you want to talk about the formal experiments that started after the Second World War, and or do you want to talk about the experimental film of the 20s? It's so many. Eisenstein, Vertov, is that experimental? I don't know. There's so many different histories. And of course, there's some histories of experimental film that were more tied to what is called artistic modernity, and the focus on the medium itself after Greenberg and so forth. But that experimental film is so many things and can be so many things. But of course, you have to keep on experimenting, and not only with the medium, but also with whatever cinema holds as possibilities.
Other questions?
Yeah, so you referred before to Deleuze's cinema books, and I was curious because also kind of maybe relates to this last question, but oversimplifying a little bit, but when he develops and he talks about the birth of modern cinema, so one of the main claims that he says is that this also comes from a crisis in the classical narrative modes, as you refer to, but also he talks about this, let's say, overwhelmingness of reality in which it was impossible to react. So he talks about this figure of the character that cannot react, and this being overwhelmed, and that moves into these new modes in which cinema develops that he brands within modern cinema. So I'm kind of curious, because there seems to be kind of parallel in some of these to what you are describing. What would be the difference of that moment that Deleuze is developing in this whole brand from neo-realism to Nouvelle Vague to what the situation that you're describing now? Because the crisis he's already describing from many decades, but you seem to be talking about something specific now. So I'm curious about this difference.
Well, of course, what Deleuze was trying to describe in his book, this opposition that he proposes between the movement image and the time image and so forth. This was all already based on what other people like Bazin had proposed, the fact that the Second World War was a kind of cut in history, and then history of cinema including, and that's the same or kind of mutation of that narrative that also Godard uses in Histoire du Cinéma and so forth. It's an old division that has been worked upon and has taken on different forms. Now, what Deleuze proposes is that there is indeed a difficulty to think about cinema in terms of movement, but also in terms of certain narrativity, and he points then to neo-realism and the cinema of Rossellini, for example, as a new kind of cinema, the cinema of the time image that perhaps gives more attention to observation than to the typical cinema of fiction. But at the same time, when you look at Rossellini's films, there is a certain predeterminedness. There's certain rules of emplotment, and there are certain lines that run through all his work. I think all his characters have a specific path in his films, I think. So it has never been as simple as that, I think, and it has never been simple to say that the Second World War was really a divisive cut in the history of cinema. I think, of course, there's also sensitivities of documentary that are also in fiction. When you look now at films of Nicholas Ray, and you're like completely overwhelmed, because he has in his films and his best films, there is a certain sensitivity to very simple things, to faces and gestures, and so I don't know. For me, it's something else. It's not a cut that I'm talking about. It's just a shift in sensibility and a shift in the research of filmmakers that I feel, and a move away of thinking about fiction or practicing fiction and cinema from the old rules and the dominant use of fiction as a set of guidelines, as a certain ordering of time and all that. I don't know. Am I answering something or?
Yeah, just because I'm curious, because those different practices you described was a linear path. The letter was also talking about Stoffel Debuysere or Godard, in which basically this is also put into crisis. So I'm curious, I mean, I see what you pointed out, I'm curious into your, let's say the way you connect to symptoms that are happening now. So I'm curious about how those symptoms are more intrinsically different or going into a completely different direction. Because of course in the list there's like huge spectrum of examples that he shows, but there are some which go into this direction of really breaking up completely the narrative, just like you're describing now. So that's why I'm curious, what's the specificity, or how can you explain the specificity of what happens now? It's very different to what he calls is the crisis of the movement image in that moment.
No, I think what I tried to say, and not what Deleuze didn't say, is for me it's really about the starting point. And the starting point in a lot of films I hold dear, more recent films, let's say the last 10 years or so, 15 years perhaps, is the starting point is something very, very concrete, very, very simple, often very mundane, perhaps, or very, very, very everyday, that is used as a starting point to develop something of which the outlines are never predetermined. And yeah, that's perhaps the documentary impulse, let's say, but also the openness towards anything can happen. And the question of fiction is always, or the starting point of fiction is always when something happens. And I think that's the research, when does something happen, when especially does something unexpected happen, starting from something very concrete, starting from a sense of curiosity. So that's what I propose with, or what I think is interesting in the so-called fictions of the real, which is perhaps not the best term to describe it. It's just something that I feel and I see, and I often talk about with the people I work with. And not, it's people talk about the hybrid of documentary and fiction and so forth and so forth. But it's really for me about the starting point and this openness, the receptivity, let's say. And also to perhaps, again, find a fiction where it's not supposed to be.
Yeah, beautiful. This is, I feel, a beautiful summary or conclusion. I'm sorry we have to wrap up a little bit and take a short break to prepare for the performative reading of Philippe César with sound by Jim Mustafa, which is called Meteorizations. And I would like to thank you so much, Stoffel, for the wonderful lecture and talking to us.
Thank you.